Okay. Back in Genesis tonight. So last week we had communion. Here we are back at Genesis. We're in chapter 35 tonight. Again, reading through all of these chapters, you just realize you're always confronted with the fact that these are some pretty flawed people. So, we will kind of pick back up in the narrative tonight, in the story. And, another thing that's really kind of interesting, because we have a trip, you always hear me talking about, we have a trip coming up next year. And when you hear these places, when you hear Hebron and Shechem and Bethel and places like that, I'd love to go check some of these places out. But they're just such contentious areas. And I'm also thinking about all the stuff going on in this country. Boy, the world is on edge, and this idea of the perplexity that Jesus talked about in Luke's gospel when he mentioned about what it would be like as his return kind of comes into view, and how the world is just being pressed in with no seeming end in sight kind of thing. It's kind of amazing. Well, where we are tonight, we'll pick up 2 weeks ago. We looked at the first few verses of this, and there's going to be in chapter 36 a complete departure from the story of the descendants of Jacob and his sons and all of that, and you're going to get into kind of a side trip to give a bit of information about Esau's generations. And so we'll get a little bit into that split that had taken place and what ended up coming kind of full circle towards the end of their lives. And then back to Joseph. And now Joseph is going to take kind of a prominent role in so much of going forward in Genesis. So it's going to be kind of interesting. There's I guess you can almost say a bit of a transition, because what we will get to, possibly, tonight is looking at the story that we're all familiar with of Joseph. And as I jokingly would say, if we want to try to make the equivalence, where his brothers kind of sell him to the circus. And so this is what happens tonight in the text. So chapter 35, we will repeat a little bit of the last of what we left off with 2 weeks ago. A couple of things to point out, and then we'll get right into the text. So chapter 35 of Genesis, let's have a word of prayer. Father, we thank you once again for your faithfulness to us, to give us your word, and to also, to those who believe in you, you've given us your Holy Spirit as well to lead us and guide us in truth. And so as we look at this historical part of what was the beginning of the nation, we ask, Lord, that you would help us to understand not only the history, but make the proper application when we can to the events that we see and why they're important. So we ask, Lord, that you would be glorified in us tonight and glorified through the study of your word, that we would grow thereby. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen? So chapter 35 begins with this. Then God said to Jacob, "Arise and go to Bethel and dwell there and make an altar there to God." So he's told here at this point, I want you to go back to kind of where it all started. So if you remember when he was going to get a wife, this is the place that it said, and he happened upon a place. Didn't mention it as being Bethel, but it was where he had that vision of the angels ascending and descending. And so he named it at that time Bethel, or house of God. Now here, after all of this time, and he's gone, and he's, Leah and Rebekah have become his wives, and he's had sons, and all of this is beginning to take place. If you were here for the last study, the intrigues of what happened, just really kind of an awful thing that happened with their sister, and then their reaction. And so the sons and what they did to the people that were there when all of that stuff happened. In the last couple of chapters we studied it. Just kind of a really awful part of history. And so at this point, Jacob is concerned, because now the people of the land, their concern is that they're going to come after us because of the actions of his sons. What it also helps us, and I pointed it out the last time, and it will definitely come up tonight, is that God has a perfect work that he's going to do in this nation in bringing it about, though it is incredibly troubled. And frankly, when you look at Jacob and his sons, there's a lot of dysfunction in this family. There's a lot of messed up stuff that they do, and yet it is that God knows what is going to be the end result of all of this, And so often it becomes evident as you study through the Scriptures that he uses incredibly imperfect people because he has a perfect work that is going to come of it. Well, here we have that. So we have at chapter 35, so he tells him, go back to Bethel, kind of where it all started, make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from the face of Esau your brother. Now we know that they've already reconciled by this time, and so he is going back into the land of Canaan where he was from, or originally from, that of his father. And it says, and Jacob said to his household and to all who were in it, put away the foreign gods that are among you, purify yourself and change your garments. So this is the recognition, look, we're coming back into a place. It's time to leave behind all of this stuff. And I find this to be really important as well. How do you make an application to something like this to us here? And so the idea that God refers to himself in the Scripture as a jealous God. He's not going to share the heart and the desire of the people with him. It's like pick a side, do one or the other. And so here, this time now, God is appearing to him. So this is this visible, how does this happen? We call them theophanies. This is, I believe, pre-incarnate Jesus comes to see him, takes on physical form because he appears to him, and it's a physical thing as you're going to see. And so it tells him, take with your household, put away the foreign gods, cleanse yourselves, be prepared. Verse 3, let us arise and go to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God, and who answered me in the day of my distress, and has been with me in the way in which I have gone. So he's able to look at this in full circle. Remember what had happened. He gets the birthright. Esau says he's a dead man as soon as Dad's gone. And so he flees under the guise of going to find a wife. And he's gone for decades, a couple of decades, 20 some odd years, until he's finally starting to come back into the land. And this is all what's transpired since then. Verse 4 says, so they gave Jacob all of their foreign gods in which they had in their hands, and the earrings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the terebinth tree that is in Shechem, or was by Shechem. Now, again, here's just one of those funny things. People will worship just about anything. Have you noticed that? It's bizarre. But here, you've got to ask yourself a question. If your God can be buried underneath a tree, is he really a God at that point? Just an interesting question to ask. And so they don't seem really bothered by this. Okay, well, we'll just give him back. Well, it says, and so they journeyed, and as they journeyed, the terror of God was upon the cities that were all around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. And remember, Jacob's concern was that with what you just did, you wiped out an entire town of young men. And it was all because of one of the sons, actually the son of the head of the area, had basically raped his sister. And so the brothers get all up in arms. Now it's funny, funny not in the sense of ha-ha, but funny in the way of irony, that you're going to find that these same guys who were so filled with their righteous indignation over their sister, one of them's a pretty messed up character himself, and then all of the brothers plot to kill the youngest one and have to be talked out of it. It's just a bizarre thing how you can be so righteous at one time and such a carnal dirtbag the next. Well, this is the brothers. Well, so anyhow, you find in verse 5, and so they journeyed, and the terror was upon the cities. Now, verse 6, Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, and which is in the land of Canaan, and he and all the people who were with him. So here he's now firmly back in the land. This is the land of the promise, which will come up in the text tonight. Now Deborah, look at verse 8. It says, now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried below Bethel under the terebinth tree there, and so the name of it was called Elon Bakuth, and so that is the oak of weeping. Now, if you read through it really quick, you miss the point. This seems to come out of nowhere, but it really tells you that here Jacob's mother has probably already passed because she hasn't been mentioned. And this is actually her nurse that is mentioned. So it kind of brings you to the point of, wow, time has really moved on. Now, his father has not yet left the scene. That's going to come up later in our text. So verse 9 tells us, then God appeared to Jacob. And so here again, this is the appearance that I was referring to. There's this face-to-face that takes place here. It's not just some cloud. It's not some voice. There's an appearance that takes place here. And so God appeared to Jacob again. It's not the first time that it's taken place. Think of his wrestling and the fact that he had worshipped the messenger who had yanked his leg out of socket where he had the limp the rest of his life. And when he bowed to him and he worshipped him, this messenger didn't correct him. And no angel in his right mind would ever accept having any kind of worship ascribed to him. Well, now it's happened again. He has another appearance. And so notice who it says appeared to him. Who is it that appeared? God appeared to him. Well, I thought God had no shape or form. Well, when you think of the Father, yes, but is there a God who actually, person that is represented as God that took on a human form? Jesus. Yeah. So, it says, now when he came from Padan Aram, and he blessed him, and so God said to him, your name is Jacob, your name shall not be called Jacob any more, though, but Israel shall be your name. And so he called his name Israel. Now, that had already been done back in chapter 32. But now it's like, don't want to refer to him as Jacob any longer. We want to start to mention, this was the name given to him when he did that wrestling thing. And so he called him the one who has contended, or the one who has strived with God. So it tells us in verse 11, now God said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations will proceed from you, and kings will be coming or will be born from your body. Now the kings would end up coming through Judah. And so the line of the kings, think David and all the rest of the descendants, came that way. And really that's ultimately the line which would end up giving us Jesus as well, who will ultimately be the king above all kings and the Lord above all lords. So he tells him this. Now he's also going to mention the kind of land that is mentioned here. So the land which I gave Abraham and Isaac, I now give to you, and to your descendants after you, I give this land. Now where was that given to him first? It's found in chapter 15 of Genesis, back at verse 18. If you want to know what the dimensions of that land is, go back and read it. It's chapter 15, and it's said to Abraham, and then of course it is then told to Isaac, and now it's come down to Jacob. But that is basically from the river, the Nile in Egypt, which picks up at the Mediterranean, then empties down towards the south. And then the other one is the Euphrates. So go ahead and take a look at what is the length of both of those rivers on a map, and now you understand the extent of what the nation of Israel should look like. It means you take up a whole bunch of Egypt. You take up an awful lot of Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. And boy, you want to talk about going back to original borders, man. This would start World War III tomorrow. And yet he tells him, this is the land that I've given to you and to your descendants, beginning with the first promise at Abraham and now down to his grandson. So God went up from him to the place where he had talked with him. And so Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had talked with him, and a pillar of stone. And so he poured out a drink offering, and he poured out oil upon it. Now, this is similar to what had happened the last time that he was at Bethel. And so there was the putting up of a stone, or a thing of remembrance there. And this time there's a libation offering, or a drink offering, which is kind of interesting because there's no law. Now the law was where you find specified what kinds of offerings were to be done, grains and libations and sacrifices and blood and all those different kinds. That's all the stuff in the law. And this is before there is a law. This is really before there's a priesthood. This is way before Moses. And yet, even at this time, there was the recognition of various types of offerings that would be given. So, he poured out this offering, verse 15 says, and so Jacob called the name of the place where he spoke with him Bethel. Now, that's already kind of known to us. Bethel means house of God, but you're going to notice that he puts a little variation on it. Now, the next part of this is kind of interesting, and we know that there is so much focus on Joseph, but Benjamin is now mentioned in this. Now, there are a couple of things interesting about Benjamin. Benjamin, of course, is the last one. We're going to find that this is beginning at verse 16, as they get into the land. And now here we're going to find that Rebecca is going to be, Rachel, rather, is going to die in childbirth. But Benjamin is the son that comes from this, and he's the only one that's actually born in the promised land. So of all of the sons born to Jacob, all the ones that would be the tribes of Israel, only one of them, the last son, is the one that is born there in the promised land. And of all the sons that we know, he's the only one that Jacob actually names. The other ones were named by the moms. And in fact, she would have named this one, but Jacob kind of prevails in this when he's named. So verse 16 tells us, and so as they journeyed from Bethel, and when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem, Rachel labored in childbirth, and she had a hard labor. And now it came to pass, when she was in hard labor, that the midwife said to her, "Do not fear, you will have this son also." And this will be the last of the sons born to Jacob. And so it was, as her soul was departing, for she died, that she called his name Ben-Oni, and his father rather called him Benjamin. Now, Ben-Oni would have been, it depends on who you ask. It's really hard to track down what these names mean, because each of them had a name that meant something. The scholars are really kind of disagreeing on what this means, but I guess you could say the consensus is that this means the son of my sorrows, because she knows she's going to die in childbirth. And yet what Benjamin, ultimately his name, Benjamin, would mean the son of my right hand, or the son of power. And so we'll find out that there are things about the tribe of Benjamin as we study through. Each one of the tribes came to be known by different things. So Levi would be the sons that you would have for the priesthood, and then Judah would be the line with the kings. And so various types of things would happen within the tribes. Benjamin, of course, kind of more on the warrior side of things. Paul, Saul of Tarsus, Paul was of Benjamin. And so anyway, this is the last of the sons born. So it tells us, it came to pass when she was in labor, verse 17, do not fear that you will have this son, is what she was told. And then the names are told to us in verse 18. And ultimately in verse 19, so Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, and that is Bethlehem. Now, this is a place that you can go, and of course, like most, quote, tombs that you can visit in Israel, it's really, really doubtful that these tombs are actually the tombs. This is just where tradition holds. It's just outside of Bethlehem, very heavily contested, and it's really amazing because before the place was re-inhabited, before Israel was back in the land, this was there. There are pictures of it before 48 and all the rest of it, and there was this place. It was considered Rachel's tomb, and it was this domed little place with a fence around it, no big deal. Now you look at it today, because it's a contested area and because it's in the West Bank, it has that huge concrete fence around it so that the people traveling on the other side of it can't be attacked. And there are these huge murals over it, and there's a synagogue that's there, and it's a big contested area. It's amazing that once God brought the Jews back into the land, now everybody cares about the land that they never cared about before. Such a bizarre thing. I'd love to go and visit some of these places, but tour buses don't go to them. Well, anyhow, there is this place, and so it was just outside of Bethlehem, and so Jacob, in verse 20, set a pillar on the grave, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. And verse 21 says, so Israel journeyed and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Ader. And it happened when Israel dwelt in the land that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard about it. Now, here again, like I've mentioned before, these are the same sons that were just incensed over what had happened to their sister. And they, actually, again, if you were studying with us the last time, they wiped out pretty much a whole city of young men, those that were of kind of fighting age, over the incident. And they did so by all kinds of horrible trickery. And it was just, what a sordid story this is. Now, here we have, again, you would figure, okay, great. They had that horrible lapse, and they were just really awful and not led by God, and they dishonored the name and all the rest of it. And you'd figure that they'd learn their lesson. Well, here we see that this is Reuben. Now, Reuben was the firstborn. He's the oldest of the sons. And if you don't remember Bilhah, Bilhah was actually one of Jacob's concubines way back at the beginning. She also happens to be the mother of, I wrote these down, of Dan and Naphtali, his brothers. All right, so let's wrap our minds around this. The oldest brother has relationship with two of their brothers' mom. Gross. This is so messed up. Now, it's a different story because this is not quite all of what the Bible tells us of what is acceptable as far as God is concerned is not yet necessarily put in place. But it kind of is too. Because remember, by the time that Jesus is talking with the people about divorce, and they come to him and they say, well, Moses gave us a writ of divorcement. Okay, that's what was in place. But remember what Jesus had said? Wasn't that way in the beginning. The reason you have that is because of the hardness of your own hearts. Because in that place, if you were to cast off a wife and not divorce her, she could be treated as just a common servant. She would just be kind of put on the shelf and put away. And so it'd be better for her to be given a writ of divorcement than to have to live in the conditions that she would live as a wife out of favor. And that's because of the hardness of the heart of the men. So in this case, once again, would God have had anything to do with this? Absolutely not. This would be something disgusting. So anyway, Israel heard about it. So Israel or Jacob heard about it. But nothing is really said of it. Notice how we have just this second part of verse 23. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. Goes right on past it. Nothing happens. Well, the sons of Leah, so mentioned first by Leah, the first of his wives, were Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. And the sons of Rachel, now the second of the wives that were ones that he had gone to Laban to get or to obtain. Sons of Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. And then, of course, you have mentioned here Bilhah. Rachel's maidservant were Dan and Naphtali. And the sons of Zilpah were, Leah's maidservant, were Gad and Asher. And these were the sons of Jacob who were born to him at Padan Aram. Now, technically, 11 of the 12 were born at Padan Aram. The last one was born by the time that they came into Canaan. So there's been speculation. Of course, it's the same person writing this. So it's not as though he doesn't know the history. It's rather the heritage that came from that place. You could easily say, yeah, except for Benjamin, but these are the sons that were born to him is more the issue. Well, you'll see in verse 27, it says, then Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kirjath Arba, that is in Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had dwelt. So Hebron, another one of those places I would love to go and check out. But it's not one of the places that you go to in a tour bus. If you have private tours, you can go as just a small group of the people who know their way around there can get you to these places. But this is the place that the UN, if you remember just a few weeks ago, had tried to set it up as a, quote, Palestinian heritage site. And when they talked to Netanyahu, he said, hey, did you notice who's buried there? The patriarchs of Israel. Some of them are. It is just hilarious. There is no history of the Palestinian people as a government, and yet the patriarchs of Israel that God gave the land to are buried in that place. And the UN can't figure it out. I find that so comical. I guess you guys don't think it's as funny as I do. But, man, these people, seriously, if you have any situation, you have a one side or another, one side's right, one side's wrong, the UN will always be on this side. Now, this is, again, one of the things, I probably have said this, maybe some of you have never heard me mention this before. One of the places that I really get a kick out of, when Solomon's time, there in Israel, when he was the king, he had all the wives and concubines. Between the two of them, he had 1,000 wives or concubines. And so they were just given to him as kind of, tribute or whatever else. And so they couldn't stay in the palace, and some of them wanted their own idolatry and all the rest, so they kind of put him on a little hill just outside of Jerusalem. And it was referred to as the hill of evil counsel or evil speaking. So what sits on top of that hill today? The UN. You can't make this stuff up. To me, this is just, yet again, proof of God's sense of humor. This is hilarious. So anyway, you can see it when you're there. We always point it out. Well, anyhow, now, the days of Isaac were 180 years. Here's an interesting question. Do you remember what it was that started the whole birthright thing and the blessing of the son? Was it not Isaac saying, hey man, I can't see anymore. I'm just about dead. So before I die, make me that savory food that I love so much. And he says that to Esau. Well, as Esau is going out, mom jumps into action with Jacob and says, let's do this. I'll make the food and we'll get you to smell and feel like your brother, and then we'll let Dad bless you. Well, that was expected, but notice what has taken place since then. He went off. He's been married. I mean, we are talking decades here since that whole episode took place. And here Isaac thought, I'm a dead man. Well, he turns out to be 180 years old, and his son has been gone for decades and now is back. So it seems like his dad may have been just a little, almost kind of like Esau in the first place when he sold his birthright. Man, if I don't get something to eat, I'm going to die. And remember, it was Jacob that said, okay, I'll give you something to eat, but it's going to cost you. You're going to need to give me your birthright. Well, it seems like this kind of drama runs in the family. I got to eat something or else I'm just a dead man. Well, in this case, he was only, decades late. Depending on who you ask and how they dated, it could be anywhere from 40 to 80 years later. So, yeah, he missed it by a little bit. So verse 29 says, so Isaac breathed his last, and he died, and he was gathered to his people, being old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So by this time they are back, and things are back the way that they are. Now, chapter 36 really deals only with the heritage or the lineage of Esau, and it's done in one chapter. Because just about every single one of these names is not something that you find recorded in the Bible. But the Bible does keep in place a way of securing a few things. It puts in place the genealogy from Esau. It also does give you evidence that God made good on his promise to Esau. You're not going to be the son of the promise. You're not going to be the one with the birthright, but God said that he would still bless him. And as you look at this, you can see, needless to say, that he absolutely did. Possessions and things and family and heritage and all the rest of it definitely was his, no question. Well, as you read on, we'll just read a little bit of it. I'll kind of highlight some things for two reasons. One, these people are lost to us in history. There's nothing that tells us other than this person begat that person, and I'm horrible with these names. And you would have to endure 40 or so verses of me trying to pronounce names that we don't know anything about them, and I would embarrass myself and you as well. And then I'd have to wake you up by the time we got to chapter 37. So verse 1 tells us, now this is the genealogy of Esau, who is Edom. So we know that through the history you had Moab and Edom and Ammon. And so Ammon to the north, Moab in between, Edom to the south. As you look at basically the dividing line today in Israel is the River Jordan. So from your perspective, everything to this side is Israel. Everyone to that side is really modern day Jordan. But you would have Ammon, and then below that Moab, and then below that Edom. And this would be the area where Esau is known. This is where his heritage was. He is Edom. He's known as the territory Edom. So Esau took his wives from the daughters of Canaan. And remember, that was the problem. That was why there was such a problem with Isaac and Rebekah, that they were troubled over the fact that he married the women of the land. Yeah, it was the land of the promise, but it was not of the family heritage. These were pagan women. That was such a troublesome thing. It was why they sent Jacob back to the family, which we see how that all worked out. And so, I mean, talk about a bunch of connivers. Boy, if that's the best you can do by going to your family, you got trouble. But going to pagans was even worse. And yet, Laban was a pagan. So anyway, you get the picture. So, he took wives from the daughters of Canaan. But now look at verse 6. So Esau took his wives, his sons, his daughters, and all the sons of his household, his cattle, his animals, all of his goods which he had gained in the land of Canaan, and he went to a country away from the presence of his brother Jacob, for their possessions were too great for them to dwell together, and the land where they were strangers could not support them because of their livestock. And so Esau dwelt in Mount Seir, Esau is Edom, and this is the genealogy of Esau, the father of the Edomites in Mount Seir. What we are kind of wondering about this, and there are a couple of possible explanations for it. We know that the split between Jacob and Esau happened over the whole birthright thing, and the fact that he felt slighted and ripped off, and they seem to have sent Jacob away pretty quickly. So he was gone. It doesn't seem like the separation was over the flocks and herds at the beginning, but by the time Jacob comes back into the land, yeah, they've both got lots of stuff. And so some have speculated, did Esau come back to the family home for some time, leaving from Edom or Seir, when his brother came back in and his father's death was at hand and all the rest, only to separate again because there was just not enough room for them both. So speculation and all the rest of it. What we do know is at one point the separation wasn't over a problem. It seemed to be an agreeable thing. Though when Esau first went away, it was because of a lot of family drama, and Jacob went away for fear of his life. Interesting. So however it is, we do know the big operative thing, going back to Edom, and that was where that whole thing began. It's going to set up what would be a problem for generations, for hundreds of years. The warring factions and the fact that Edom and Ammon and Moab and all those places that are in Jordan, they're still all from the same family, all the way back to Ishmael and all that stuff, which is going to come up here a little bit later. All of that stuff, all of that problem that there was, really it all comes from the same family, just the estrangement, and then moving towards the east in what is modern-day Jordan. So you'll see how that kind of plays out. So it says that this is the genealogy at verse 9. Let's go forward to verse 31. And there's an interesting thing that is said here too. This gives you an idea just how many generations. And I didn't go through to count them up, but there are a number of generations. And it goes through, here's the sons, here are the chiefs of the tribes, even to the point of kings as they began to reign in the area. And it gives it generation by generation. But notice how it's said here. Now, these were the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over Israel or reigned over the children of Israel. So it's hard to try to line up where this all started. We do know that as far as the Edomites were concerned, they started being reigned over by kings. And it was done before Israel. So, how far were they into that series of reigns of the kings before Israel started to do it? Let's think about it in these terms. What you have right here in front of you is the sons are now back in the land under Jacob or Israel. You have the sons that are now all born to him. What's going to happen, Joseph is going to be sold to the circus, right? Going to wind up in Egypt, and he's going to take up a place only behind Pharaoh in prominence. The sons are going to have to come to him by famine. This is really the rest of the book of Genesis. And they're going to, from that point on, shortly thereafter, it starts a series of over 400 years before Moses is able to lead the people, the children of Israel, out. Now they're going to come back into the land, and they're going to be kind of a theocracy. From Moses to Joshua through the time of the judges was really when it started to move in a wrong direction, only to bring them to the point where they wanted a king. So there were kings operating in Edom hundreds of years before that even started in Israel. Makes you wonder, is this part of the reason why the people in Israel had said, we want to be like the nations around us? The idea that there's a monarchy that's going on. At least one was happening in Edom, and other groups were known by their kings or their ultimate leaders. Anyway, it's all speculation. But what you get from all of chapter 36, what you had in chapter 35 was these are the sons of Jacob. And you only have about 3 or 4 verses that says, these sons were born to Leah, these to Rachel, Bilhah, Zilpah. And so from that point, you have just a few of those. That's the genealogy, because it's going to trace it generation by generation from this point on. He's able to consolidate everything of saying, yeah, this is another son of Isaac, and his name is Esau, and here's his generations. Now, notice how it changes immediately back to, okay, now that that's out of the way, let's get back to Jacob. So chapter 37. Now, notice how often you get the change of mentioning him as Jacob or Israel. Same guy. We a lot of times say Israel thinking of the nation or the people or the geographical location, but let's keep in mind that it's known by the name of one of its patriarchs, Jacob. So when you hear Israel, think of the context. Is it speaking about Israel, the person, Jacob, who became Israel by name? Or are we talking about the people in the land? It's obvious by the context. So Jacob dwelt in the land where his father was a stranger, that is the land of Canaan. Now, this is the history of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, right? She loved him. Dad didn't love him quite as much. They had their favorites. So you would think Jacob, of all people, would say, you know what, I just know the kind of strife that caused with me and my brother. I'm not going to repeat the same thing. Right? Makes sense? He does the same stupid thing. Verse 3, Israel loved Joseph more than all of his children. Why? Because he was the son of his old age. Well, I thought that was Benjamin. Benjamin was the last son born to him by Rachel. Joseph was the first born to him by Rachel, but he was the 11th of the 12th. But for some reason, he loved him more. Well, son of his old age. And so his father made for him a tunic of many colors, this coat, whatever it is, however it was made. It was, again, a constant reminder to his brothers that his father loved this son more. And so every time that they would see it, there was just this resentment. Well, if that wasn't bad enough, I don't see any real guile in Joseph, but he begins to tell them things that God showed him, and I don't know how it was said other than what we have in the text, but it wasn't received well by his brothers. Look at what it says. So his brothers saw that his father loved him more than all of his brothers, and so they hated him, and they could not even speak peaceably to him. Now, of course, this is the younger brother. It's like, don't the older brothers always pick on the younger brothers? Yeah, technically, but now they're in their 20s and 30s. And Joseph is just a teenager. It's not like they're little kids anymore. They're now grown men. Well, there's this real hatred. So it says, now Joseph had a dream, and he told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. Well, why? Gosh, you just told him a dream. Well, wait till you find out what the dream is. So he says to them, please hear this dream that I have dreamed. So he says, let me have your attention. You guys got to hear this. This is really important. Well, there we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and also stood upright, and indeed your sheaf stood all around and bowed down to mine. Like, if your brothers don't hate you now they really hate you. Because they're thinking, well, you have a real high opinion of yourself, don't you? Pretty convenient you dreamed a dream like that you're greater than all the rest of us. Well, it does not stop there. So, verse 8, and his brothers said to him, shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? Well, the answer is yes. And when's it going to play out? In Egypt. After you sell him to the circus. After Pharaoh puts him in his house, and when you guys come because of famine in this land and he saves your necks, yeah, that's when it's going to happen. And by that time, they're thinking, we're dead men. Well, hold on tight because we still have chapters to get to that point. So then he dreamed still another dream. Oh, great. Can you imagine if you're Joseph? Nothing in this gives the impression that Joseph said, man, the last time I did this did not go over well. Maybe I just won't tell him this one. Well, because this one involves mom and dad. Uh-oh. Well, So he dreamed this dream, still another one, and he told it to his brothers, and he said, look, I have dreamed another dream. I'm picturing the brothers like, great. So he says, look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and the 11 stars bowed down to me. So he told it to his father and to his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said, so what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I bow, and your brothers indeed come and bow down to the earth before you? And his brothers envied him, but his father kept this matter in mind. Well, he's the favorite son, so you can't do much about it, but now he's done this. I want to do an interesting little side trip, because how many of you have heard, excuse me, there's a speculation by some within the church that some big event is going to happen on September the 23rd. How many of you guys have heard this? About 5 of you in this whole room. Okay. It's because there's this really... Oh, another one up there in the balcony. Who's that up there waving at me? Oh, it's Abhishek. Is that Abhishek up there? Is that who you are? Okay. So anyway, there's this celestial thing that's supposed to happen, and it's the alignment of the stars. And it's right around the time of one of the feasts that's going to be taking place, and everybody is looking at Revelation chapter 12. Ooh. So do you think we should go look at chapter 12 of Revelation? Yeah, I hear all the murmuring. Yes, let's do this. Chapter 12. Now, I realize this is incredibly dated now because we're making a big deal about this. And if people listen to this a year from now, they'll go, what in the world was that all about? Chapter 12. We get this. Now, a great sign appeared in heaven, and a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head garland of 12 stars. And then being with child, she cried out in labor pain and gave birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having these horns and crowns and all the rest of it. Now, what's important is the noticing of the sun and the moon and the 12 stars. Now, this has been traditionally believed, as I do, it's speaking of Israel. And the man-child that came forth from was Jesus, and it covers a couple thousand years. It has been the intention of the devil from the get-go to try to not only kill Messiah, but to wipe out the promised people. And so throughout history, we have it repeated over and over and over again that one person after another has come onto the scene historically looking to eliminate the entirety of the Jewish nation, and always have failed miserably, though they have done devastating impact to the Jewish people through history. We have, my goodness, a number of countries that want to do the exact same thing right now here in front of us. So here's the thing. When you look at chapter 12, it is either speaking of some celestial event that people say is going to take place on the 23rd of September. And so they look at the stars as being very literal. And there are going to be signs and all the rest of it, just like it says here, where I look at it and say, well, the sun, the moon, and the 12 stars really sounds an awful lot like chapter 37 here. Because what we do know is that during the tribulation, who's the focus? The focus is on the people of Israel and God bringing them back to Him. And it's also judgment upon the people who are on the earth. That's what Revelation talks about. It's the pouring out of the wrath of God. The church is not mentioned after the discussion of them after chapter 3. They're nowhere found in the text, not until they're mentioned much later is the church mentioned at the end of the book. In between are the judgments on the unrepentant. And the unrepentant are also some within Israel who come to a knowledge of their Messiah. So the idea that there's a focus on the nation of Israel is pretty obvious, because look at where it's all taking place. It's Jerusalem. None of this is symbolic. All of this is literal, though there are signs and there's imagery that is used that is symbolic of the nation right here. Sun, moon, stars. Where else do we find the exact same configuration of that but in the sons of Jacob? Jacob representing the sun, the mother representing the moon. It's right there in this dream that Joseph has. And of course the sons are represented in that. So who is that the devil will be going after in the tribulation? He's looking to wipe out Israel. It's always been that way. And of course it's about world domination too, but the focal point of all of this stuff is in Israel. So there's one of two ways you look at this whole thing in chapter 12 of Revelation. Is it talking about a celestial event, as some say? To me, I would basically say, well, let's see if the people who really believe that are that wed to the idea. Sign everything over to me that you own, and if we're here on the 24th, I own it. We'll find out how sold you are to your idea. None of them will do it. But, I don't want to mock it too much. But the idea that when I hear those kind of things, just like, okay, let's talk on the 24th. And I won't tell you I told you so, but, that's the idea that you could nail down and tell me that this is when the rapture of the church is going to happen. Okay. Based on that, that's some pretty flimsy evidence. But here's the good thing about it. We only need about a month and a few days to figure it out. We'll know. So, how many of you guys didn't know that? What's that? So, there you go. Now you can start looking at your calendar. And here's the thing. The people that the people that said this are like, you should be warning people. You should be telling them this. And all the rest of us like, hey, if this happens, I'm out of here anyway. I am certainly not going to go beat the drum that this is going to be happening on the 23rd because I don't think it's on really good evidence. I'm the last person that's going to go talking about that stuff. And if you guys are right, you can give me a raspberry in heaven. So, cool. But I'm not going to get myself too worked up about it here and now. It's not the kind of evidence that you really want to say is actual besides, and it's funny when you hear them, when you bring to them the statement that Jesus said nobody knows the day or the hour. Yeah, but day or hour can mean, yeah, and then they get into all of that stuff of trying to explain it. So, whatever. All right. See, no extra charge for all that craziness. Back to chapter 37, his dream. His brothers envied him. Isn't that interesting? Not only did they hate him, but they envied him. Now, their hatred was based upon their envy. Why does Dad love him more? They might have thought that the coat was hideous, but Dad gave it to him. And now this guy's saying, I had a couple of dreams. You guys want to hear it? No. That's it. We're selling you to the circus. Well, verse 12. So his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. Now, from where we try to piece together where he is, let's just make it this way, because one of the areas where they end up going to, he goes to find them in Shechem, which isn't all that far away from where his dad was, but where they ultimately go to, there's a couple of different places that it could possibly be. Suffice to say, it is a number of miles from home. And so the brothers feel we can get away with this because it's not like it's in our backyard. So they come up with this plan. Here we get. Brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers feeding the flock in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. So he said to him, here I am. And then he said to him, please go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the flocks, and bring back word to me. And so he sent him out to the valley of Hebron, and he went then to Shechem. So these are all kind of the family, the ancestral areas between Shechem and Hebron and the various places. He sends them back out to go and look for them. It's kind of reminiscent of what ends up happening with David and Jesse and going and checking in on David's brothers when the whole Goliath thing happens. So dad sends the son, go find out what's taking place. And both of these sons are very much favored, Joseph and David, right, of their father, or at least favored as far as God is concerned. So interesting the way that there are some interesting little parallels here. Anyway, nonetheless, here are these guys, and they're tending the flock. Now their little brother's going to come and find out for their dad what's going on. Well, verse 15 says, now a certain man, unnamed, found Joseph, and there he was wandering in the field, and the man asked him, saying, what are you seeking? And so he said, I am seeking my brothers. Please tell me where they may be feeding their flocks. And so the man said, they have departed from here, for I heard them say, let us go to Dothan. And so Joseph went after his brothers, and he found them there. Well, that's the question. Where is this Dothan place? And so depending on who you ask, there are a few different possibilities. But again, suffice to say, it's drawing them further from home. All right, so let's keep in mind a few things that have taken place. It doesn't take much to remember. Dreams have come up. Joseph is the favored son, got his coat of many colors, and now he's going out to check on his brothers sent by his father. They already hate him. He's already told them that they're going to bow down, and they're going to use this as a mockery of him. Oh, we're going to bow down to you? Really? Well, I shouldn't laugh. It's pretty awful. Poor little guy. So they said, he said he's seeking his brothers. Now, verse 18. So when they saw him from afar off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. So they said to one another, look, the dreamer's coming. Oh my God. I can't imagine having brothers like this. So this is, to some of them, seemingly unacceptable course of action. These are the same guys that, through a really awful way of doing it, I mean, let's remember back. These are the same brothers, some of the same brothers who came up with the idea, hey, those guys raped our sister. Let's tell them that we'll intermarry and we'll be a part of their whole thing if they all become circumcised. And so all the men of that city become circumcised, and when they can't hardly move because of pain, they kill them all. That's pretty sordid stuff. Now these guys have not learned their lesson about ungodly, horrible, carnal things, and instead they say, hey, look, here comes the dreamer. How do we want to kill him off? Now, if not for the intervention of one of the brothers, that had been the end of it. Look at verse 20. Come, therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit. And we will say, a wild beast has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams. Wow. Now they're using it as a way of mockery. Oh, look, here comes the dreamer. Let's kill him, and we'll see what happens of his dreams. I'll show him his sheaves, and I'll show him the stars and the moon and the sun. Wow. But Reuben heard of it. Reuben, the firstborn, the guy with the whole Zilpah thing. Wow. He heard of it, and he delivered him out of their hands. And he said, let us not kill him. And Reuben said to him, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit which is in the wilderness, and do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. So a couple of these guys had pity on him. Yeah, we don't dig it. Dad's always favoring him, and he's got the nice coat and all that stuff, and he dreams dreams and tells us that we're going to bow down to him. But man, killing your brother, it's like, no, we can't do that. So it came to pass, when Joseph had come to his brothers, that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, a tunic of many colors that was on him. And they took him and they cast him into the pit, and the pit was empty, and there was no water in it. And so they sat down to eat a meal. And then they lifted up their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, and their camels bearing spices, balm, and myrrh. They were on their way to carry them down to Egypt. Now, Ishmaelites, these are basically relatives, removed by a few generations, but I mean, Ishmael, think about it. You have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. This is Isaac's brother. This is where he went into that area. They're on their way through where these guys are, on their way to Egypt. They're on the trade routes. This is the circus that I keep mentioning. So, again, I'm trying to put a more comical spin on it. I don't want to take too much liberty with the text, so don't throw stuff at me. Well, so they say this. So Judah says to them, Judah's involved in this. What profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Let's do this instead. Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brothers listened. Now, where's the guy in all of these brothers who say, you know what, he's really obnoxious, he's really full of himself, but he's our brother, we can't do this. Any of you guys that want to kill him are going to have to go through me first. Instead, the most upright of them says, let's sell him to the circus. We can make profit out of this thing. Let's go ahead and do that. So when you hear these stories, again, I'll keep repeating it because it comes up over and over and over again. God uses some really imperfect people, because he has much more long-range plans. There are things that are going to happen through these guys, and oddly enough, these are some of the better people that God has available to him. And what does that end up telling us about us? Does God use us because we're the best of the best? You know what? Honestly, I get around sometimes people who don't even believe in the same God that put the garden variety Christian to shame in their ethics and their morality and their, so many of the things that they do. So you should never get too high-minded about ourselves. Well, verse 28 tells us, then the Midianite traders passed by, so the brothers pulled Joseph up, lifted him out of the pit, sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. Oh my gosh. That's almost like, can you throw in a baseball too while you're at it? You know, something just really ridiculous. This is nothing. So they sold him, that's slave wage right there. Basically, sold him as a slave. And they took Joseph to Egypt. Then Reuben returned to the pit, and indeed Joseph was not in the pit, and he tore his clothes. So it didn't happen with all of them. They were kind of dispersed a little bit. Here comes Reuben, and he thinks, the guys that were here, my brothers, they've killed him. So he tore his clothes. This is that idea of just mourning, right? So Reuben returned to the pit. Verse 30, and so he returned to his brothers and said, the lad is no more, and where shall I go? Well, you know, what am I going to do? He's just despondent. So they took Joseph's tunic, killed the kid of the goats, and they dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, we have found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not? Now remember, that was part of the original kind of plan. We're going to kill him, and we'll put blood on the coat and tell Dad that an animal did it. That part of their story is going to be preserved. Now that he's been sold and they didn't understand the whole thing, the brothers are kind of split at this point. And so it says, so they took it. They took the thing, verse 31. They put blood of the goat on it, and then they sent it. They asked the father, "Is this it or not?" And so he recognized it, verse 33, and said, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Without doubt, Joseph is torn to pieces." And so Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth on his waist, and mourned for his son many days. And all the sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "For I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Now, if you stop to think about it, there's the fruit. Can you imagine being the brothers? Is there any conscience in this? Seems like none, and from the rest of what we'll be reading, there's really not much in the way of remorse in any of this, and yet they're finding their father. You would figure at least one of them would say, "Dad, I got to come clean on this. Here's what's happened. Now, we can catch up with these guys. We know where they were on their way to, but nothing is offered up." And so here this man is mourning for his son, and it says, verse 36, "Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard." Now we'll stop there because the next thing will take too long to go. We'll just end there at chapter 37. We'll pick up at chapter 38 next week. As you, again, read these kind of things, it is good to remember, and I pointed it out even several times tonight, it isn't as though God picked these people because they were, impeccable character and all the rest of it. In fact, as we will read when we get into other parts of the law, when God talks about why did he set his love upon them, it wasn't because of their greatness, but it was because of his love for them. And the great thing from this to remember is that God sees the plans that he has down the road. We've already seen a glimpse of what Judah's all about. He's a pragmatist. And yet it's because of Judah that we'll get David, and it's because of the promise to David that through Solomon and then through one of his sons, or not one of his sons rather, but one of his brothers, that the promise of Jesus having a clean bloodline through Judah comes all the way down, and we can have a king in Jesus who is also able to operate as a priest as well. There's some really cool stuff that comes from this, but there's not going to be perfection in this whole line until it comes through the person of Jesus. The rest of them are a series of failure after failure, and all kinds of human, irresponsibility and doing whatever seemed right in their own eyes. It did not make God the imperfect one. It just proved that he can do perfect things through imperfect people. And boy, Genesis is a perfect example of this. One last thing, and I've said it repeatedly, but I want to make sure that we mention it, or I mention it to you, because it's a very important thing that we talk to people about when we're witnessing about the Bible. And if you were to ask them, if you were trying to put forward a story, you would tend to want to leave out all the sordid stuff to put the best face that you possibly could put on your story, right? So it's like, I always mention this, if you were going to, every time, how many of you guys have filled out a resume to work? How honest are you on that thing? I'm pretty good at my job, but boy, I got some flaws too. You leave out the flaws, don't you? You basically tell them that there's no way your business is going to survive unless you hire me. That's how we handle stuff like this. In this case, God says, yeah, this is my history with my people. Incredibly imperfect, but it's because I had a much bigger picture at work in this. And I'm able to look back and say, look what I can make of very imperfect things, because there is perfection coming in Jesus. And because of his perfection, we will stand before God someday in our perfection as well because of him. Pretty cool stuff, huh? Let's stand. We have the group here. Excuse me. And we'll have a closing song. Let's end in prayer. Father, we thank you once again as we can come to your word, and so much for us to learn. Once again, being able to study history is fascinating to the heart and mind of those who love your word, because what we're seeing here is a history that has affected us. If not for these sons, then we would have no Jesus. But of course, that was always in the plan from the very beginning. We would ask, Lord, that you would help us to be students of history, because it's a history that affects us. It is what we can use to witness. It also gives us a mooring and a way to be fastened to the ground that we know is true. And so we thank you for this evening. We pray, God, that you would glorify yourself in our lives and in this place. And we thank you once again. We give you praise and honor in Jesus' name. Amen.
God bless you all. Have a great evening.